Hello, I'm Julie Swenson, Managing Director of Forward Theater Company in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mike Fisher, a Milwaukee-based theater writer and dramaturg.
I'm Jen Uphoff-Gray, founder and artistic director of Forward Theater Company. And this is Theater Forward, a twice-monthly conversation about theater from a local, regional, and national perspective. From Madison to Manhattan, we're excited to share insight into our own company while exploring issues surrounding theater in the Midwest and around the country. Welcome to episode 52 of Theater Forward. We're a full deck of cards.
Fantastic.
So this episode, we're going to talk about something inspired by our upcoming production of Samuel D. Hunter's play, Lewiston Clarkston. And that's this idea of an urban-rural or city-country divide in the theater. How extensive is that really? How does it play out? Why does it matter? And just for some context, so Samuel D. Hunter is an incredibly prolific and acclaimed contemporary playwright from Idaho. And really nearly all, if not all of his plays have been set in that section of the Northwest of this country, mostly rural, very focused on Idaho and digging deep into life there and in that part of the country. I would argue with incredibly universal themes, but set in a very specific region. And that got us thinking about this through line we often hear about in our field of there being a conflict between urban and really New York theater and writers and everybody else. And so we thought that would be an interesting topic of conversation. Mike, I know you have a lot to say about this.
Well, I'm the joker in this deck. I got a lot to say about everything. I think Hunter, to me, in some ways, and I don't have an answer as to why, feels like an exception that proves the rule. I think that rural themes and rural peoples, and let's make it even more extensive than that. Let's think about this in terms of the disconnect between New York and LA on the one hand and flyover country on the other hand, that you sometimes feel as though you're dealing with two completely different worlds. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. I mean, that, hopefully we can dig into in this conversation. I think one of them is class. I really do. I mean, the average price of a theater ticket in New York is well over $100. 80% of the people that attend theater, and this goes to the regions as well, are in the top 15% of earners. And I think that leaves a lot of people out. And to me, it calls for something like the rebirth, which you're seeing Jeremy O'Harris and others talk about, of the Federal Theater Project, which in its first 2 years, put plays in front of 20 million people in over 40,000 productions. 2/3 of the people seeing those plays, many of them outside of the cities, were seeing their very first play. Oh, and guess what? Talk about correlation being causation. 2/3 of those tickets were free, that were given to those people. So part of this, I think, is something where the national government, it's great for President Biden to talk about, an infrastructure bill, and he's absolutely right. We need one. But one of the things that ought to be included in that infrastructural bill is thinking not just about rural broadband, but about thinking about bringing plays to people that don't normally get to see them. And it's reflected in the themes. I mean, if everybody who is buying tickets is in a city, then the themes in these plays are going to reflect that, which again is why I think Samuel Hunter is an outlier. And I think maybe he's an outlier because, as you said, Jen, his themes are so universal that Idaho and some of them becomes almost a backdrop to the kinds of things that he's talking about. And so it's easier for New York audiences to have their cake and eat it too. They can slum in Idaho while still getting to talk about the things that they love to talk about.
Mike, indulge me for a second with a really personal story, but everything you were just saying brought back a memory. So my paternal grandmother, North Dakota farm girl, during the Depression worked for the North Dakota Farmers Union, part of the New Deal programs. And she was a young single woman traveling on her own around North Dakota during the 30s, visiting all of these small farming communities. And I discovered when she was in her 90s, she said, "Oh, did you know I wrote a play?" And I said, no, I didn't. And she pulled out this play that she had written as part of her exercises with these farm communities. And she was using theater as a tool to show them how collective efforts could elevate the entire community as they were dealing with the hardships of the Dust Bowl and the Depression and all of that. And for me, that when I think of a rural play, that's the first thing that comes to my mind is this beautiful little playlet that my grandmother wrote in the 30s as she was working for the government to try to help struggling communities. So thank you for bringing that memory back into my
Oh my God,
mind.
that's such a great story. So
yeah.
I have to say I have a real knee-jerk reaction to this idea of flyover country, because what it does is it dismisses 48 states. 48 states are in this flyover. And I'm seeing more and more plays from people in the flyover, in the other 48 states, that aren't sort of a denigration of this rural mentality. I mean, that's the beauty of Lewiston and Clarkston, for instance, is there's no one is being made fun of because of where they live. And I do think that as we get more and more into diverse storytelling, that we'll see more of those stories, and we'll see not just the New York story of New Yorkers in a big city. I think we are seeing more and more diversity in that way. But there are still some issues of major playwrights who are not getting their fair shake in New York. And Mike, I know you have, I'm teeing you up. You've got big opinions about that.
Well, no, but I mean, I think part of it, I want to riff on something you said, because you were talking about form in a way. And I do think that's related. I saw a wonderful play last week out of No Theater in Cincinnati, No, K-N-O-W, by Carrie Dodsovich. It was a world premiere of a play called Theater, A Love Story. And this is another playwright who, although she lives in New York, does not get nearly the productions that she should in New York. And her plays, while very cosmopolitan, don't fit the New York mode. And one of the ways they don't, and she had a hilarious riff on this in the play, is they're not what she calls sofa plays. There's a whole scene in this play in which a sofa gets set on fire and then sort of disappears, which was completely satisfying, because when you think about a sofa play or a drawing room play, it's so New York. It's also so isolated and unaware of things that go on outside of its boundaries. It's a play about usually upper middle class, white, Julie, to your point, people, unless it's being sent up by somebody like Jackie Sibley's jury. People sitting on a play talking about things. I'm not saying they're not important. I mean, I love my Edward Albee as much as everybody else, but that's not the only thing going on in the world. And I think what happens, in the same way that we're defaulting to white male as normative for so long in so many other ways in theater, a certain idea of a play gets defaulted to as white and heteronormative that leaves a lot of other things out that then get dismissed as rural or regional or non-urban, and are seen as less important because they're not dealing with these so-called more sophisticated issues.
I spent nearly 15 years working in New York City theater between my college years and then returning to my home state of Wisconsin. And, while I wouldn't ascribe, sinister or intentionally biased motives to any of it, there really was this idea in that New York City theater community that if you didn't come to New York with your talent held out in your hands to offer it up, then you didn't actually care seriously about the American theater. And there was this idea that there wasn't new work and exciting work being generated anywhere else. The assumption was that if you were a talented, aspiring, serious theater artist, then you would come to New York because that's where you needed to be. And there was a little bit of a wink and a nod towards Chicago and this idea that, well, Chicago's a pretty good theater city, but otherwise, you weren't caring about what was exciting, what was new, what was innovative, and that always just resonated with me because I had grown up here. I knew that new work was being generated all over. I knew it personally about Wisconsin, and having been back here for 16 years. And I've seen the number of exciting world premieres, exciting new playwrights, exciting artists who have, been nurtured and launched here. And then I can be a creative person, and I can look at all the other states out there and go, yep, I bet this is happening everywhere else too. But very little that gets that seal of approval from the awards, the recognition that can really launch a career. And I think about some of the playwrights that I have been most excited about as a producer here at Forward, who really have not gotten the attention from the major, New York critical establishment that I think they deserve. I mean, obviously, all of us think of Lauren Gunderson as our primary example, but here's the most produced playwright in America for multiple years running now. And not just kind of ignored by most of the New York critical establishment, but dismissed, sometimes really viciously so. And that, that gets my back up quite a bit. But I also think, somebody like Ike Holter, who is a brilliant writer, and this is less about the urban-rural divide and more about the New York versus the rest of the country divide, doing some of the most exciting writing that I've read in the last decade. And his plays are really pretty much all set in Chicago. And he's getting a ton of productions and buzz around the country. But where's his big New York production? Haven't.
But just as you said, does he need a big? I mean, Ike might say, yes, I do. So I'm not going to speak for Ike. But just as you were saying, like that gives, and it's still true. If you've gone to New York and then you've come out of New York, there is some sort of badge of honor. I mean, I make sure that I say I lived there for 7 years and I worked. That there's something about living there that gives value and validity to what we're doing now, which we can talk about. And then secondly, if Lauren are doing all of this work and being successful doing all of this work, do they need their Broadway debut? Is it important? And the reason we're having this conversation, I'm answering my own question, is yeah, kind of. Yes, it is. And I guess I ask you then, why? Why is it important that Lauren Gunderson, this incredible playwright, who, we've seen many, many plays that she has written and love them, and we've produced them. Why is it important that she be included in the New York, glitterati?
I would argue the first thing that comes to mind, and this goes for Lauren and in one way and for Ike in another, is representation. There are so few women playwrights being produced on Broadway. There are so few BIPOC playwrights being produced on Broadway. Here are two exceptional playwrights, beloved playwrights, exciting playwrights. And these would be beautiful opportunities to diversify. And that's the reason, because so much of the country, and maybe, it's short of saying burn it all down and Broadway doesn't matter anymore. But if this is seen as the pinnacle, then there is value for the entire field in having better representation in those X number of blocks of New York.
Right.
It's important for them. It's important for representation, and it's important for theater. I mean, think about the things that Lauren gets dinged for. She gets dinged because she's being theatrical. Especially in the final moments of her play, because New York does have a sort of suspicion. There's a theatrical versus literary divide. They like plays that are more literary. And that's not to suggest that Lauren's plays aren't beautifully written. That's not my point. But they are suspicious of those kinds of theatrical gestures, even though the whole point of theater, if we're going to survive, is leaning into its strength to tell a story differently in ways that she absolutely does as well as anybody in the country. It's her optimism. New York doesn't like optimistic plays. Lauren's plays are very optimistic in terms of what she thinks is possible. That gets dismissed in New York as cheesy. or as sentimental, or God forbid, as melodramatic. Never mind that melodrama was once a very popular art form, and I think is unfairly and pejoratively labeled as a negative. It's highbrow versus middlebrow. I mean, Lauren Gunderson writes plays about science, which nobody thinks anything about, but she does it in a way that even somebody like yours truly, who doesn't have the science background I wish I did, can understand what she's talking about. So they're educative, but in a way that's fun and in a way that is possible to be understood. So these are all important, not just for Lauren Gunderson and for representation. They're important for the future of theater. Are we going to be an increasingly esoteric art form, that plays like, Brecht on Brecht on Brecht, and I love me some Brecht as much as anybody? Or are we going to be something that can actually reach most people? And then, Jen, you're right. I think that does break down along gender lines. Why is it that, that genre in the literary world, historical fiction, romance, Westerns, why are they always dissed as lesser than? Why are writers like Sarah Orne Jewett or Eudora Welty or Willa Cather dismissed as lesser than and as regional used as a label to denigrate them? You know why? Because they're dealing with themes that aren't getting talked about on Broadway. I mean, Lauren's got domestic dramas unfolding within her historical drama. She's not saying you have to have one or the other. She's saying let's have both. Mm-hmm. And domestic plays, quote unquote, to use a really broad sweeping term, are also something that New York is suspicious of.
Yeah. I wonder, listening to this conversation and thinking as well about Lewiston Clarkston, which I'll be starting rehearsals for next week. I wonder if part of the reason that Sam Hunter has been more embraced, like you said, exception to prove the rule, is that while the settings of his plays for the typical New York audience must seem so exotic, sort of our generation Sam Shepard, if you will. But there is something about, they are, for the most part, very naturalistic. They are sofa plays in a way, except the sofa is a pup tent or a corridor at Costco. But and again, not to diminish these plays because they are stunning. That's why we're producing them. But I wonder if because they aren't as challenging in some ways in terms of their form, like you're discussing, Mike, if that makes it makes him more palatable, or also the fact that he's in New York. or in the New York area, has moved there. Has come to the center. I don't know.
I'm just thinking of with Lauren Gunderson of another thing. This is just going through my head now, and I'll probably miss some plays to which this is applicable. But baked right into the plays is this tension. Think about something like Silent Sky with Wisconsin versus Cambridge. Mm-hmm. Think about something like the Jane Austen plays, which is about the provinces versus London. There is something in her work where she is aware of the Revolutionists is another one with somebody from Haiti versus France, where there is this tension between rural and urban right there on the surface. So it's almost as though whether she's doing it deliberately or it's just the political unconscious bubbling up in her work, you're seeing it in her this tension played out in her actual plays, which I think is just fascinating.
Yeah.
Who's making these decisions in New York? We say it as like a collective, but there's not 9 million people on the island of Manhattan going, you know what I want for theater? It's a smaller group of control, and we've talked often on this podcast and just in conversations about the need for diverse criticism. Theatrical mm-hmm. criticism, and could that change what we're talking about? If there is not a couple of people in the establishment of New York determining what's good and what's bad on stage, then what is included is broader as well, and what can be seen and be sort of given the stamp of approval becomes more diverse as well.
Well, and I would say, just based on my own experience there, and critics help, and this is applying more to plays than to musicals, because they really are, in terms of Broadway, these are two very different animals. But I think when you ask who gets to decide, if I was to think of the smallest group of most influential voices in terms of what new plays and playwrights get to Broadway, I would look at the artistic directors of Lincoln Center, Manhattan Theater Club, and the Roundabout.
Yeah.
Those three nonprofit organizations that do both on and off Broadway productions. If I had to pick the smallest group, obviously there's many other voices that are involved in the bigger scale, but if those three companies started really broadening, and I think we've seen examples where they are in recent years, but I think those are a couple of very, very, very influential voices.
And where do you put the voices of the theatrical criticism from the New York Times in terms of deciding what's good and what's I mean, I don't want to have I don't want to bash anybody, but that they have inordinate power in that city.
I still remember, I mean, this was an email from Liz Duffy Adams to Jen, which she shared with me back when I was still doing criticism, and I reviewed her play which was a fabulous play given a great production by Forward Theater. And I'm paraphrasing, but she loved the review. It was a very positive review. It's a really good play, and it was really well done. And she said, there's something about, I almost feel as though the best critics, here I am patting myself on the back, come from outside of New York, that they are able to appreciate things in a different way. And I think what she was saying, if I can read between the lines, is, and this goes to something we've talked about in prior podcasts, they're more open to the idea that your job as a critic is not to give sort of a thumbs up and thumbs down with a healthy dose of snark baked into what you're doing, but to really try and appreciate comprehensively what is being done. And if you do that, just as a matter of noticing, you're forced to go outside of yourself more and pay more attention to what you're seeing rather than to come to things with a predisposed agenda. I think one of the reasons, if you read the reviews of Gunderson plays in New York, and I haven't seen the productions, so maybe they were terrible, but the gist of the reviews and the criticism is of her plays. And I think it's because people are coming at them with a preset idea of what plays are supposed to be, which is exactly the opposite in this profession of the way we should always be approaching anything that we see on stage, all of which can teach us to see the world differently. That's the whole freaking point of what we do. And we do need more critics like that. And yes, Julie, of course, if we have more diverse critics, we're going to have more of that ability to approach things from different perspectives than what we're getting right now.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we've mentioned Lauren Gunderson, of course. It's a Theater Forward podcast, so of course we've mentioned Lauren Gunderson.
Just join us. Yes. We should have a four-person podcast.
We've mentioned Ike Holter, and Mike, you've mentioned a few as well. Who are some of the other playwrights that we find really exciting that are not really getting the attention in New York yet that we feel they deserve or wish they would be getting? Who's out there that we would really love to see paid some more attention?
I'll throw out a name right off the top of my head. This is another person who is Chicago based, is Loy Webb, whose play The Light was brought to New York. It got so-so reviews there. It got rave reviews in Chicago. It's a really wonderful play, and it takes on a really tough theme about the disconnect between sometimes, or the tension is maybe a better way to say it, between race and gender within the Black community, and it's sort of loosely based on the whole R. Kelly fiasco in Chicago. So that's one name I can think of right off the top of my head. I think with Latinx playwrights, you see a lot of this, names in Los Angeles of people who are doing things that we're not getting to see as much of here. Is just, and that, again, that's another way in which theater gets regionalized. So, I mean, there are people that are getting productions in New York, but they're not necessarily getting the play that they should get in New York. And you're seeing a little bit of change with that on the issue of African-American playwrights, with the Alicia Harris and the Brandon Jacob Jenkins and the, Jackie Sibley's Drury and Jeremy O'Harris. There's some of that, but you're not seeing it really go at this point beyond that. You're not seeing Native American playwrights. No. Larissa Fasthorse is the one name people probably know, and there's so many more. I'm not really answering your question. I think it's
No, I think you are. I'm thinking another one that a playwright, again, very much top of mind because we just did her play, but I would really love to see Eleanor Burgess getting more, a little more love in New York. The Niceties isn't her only great play.
Right. Yeah. And she's lovely.
She's another one who comes to mind.
Yeah. I think of Lynn Nottage and the story of how Sweat didn't go to Broadway because she wanted the off-Broadway cast, and the producers wanted some names thrown in there or wanted to change things around, and she refused to do it. And I will always admire and love her for that. But I'd like to see more of her. I think she's an incredible playwright.
Yeah.
Well, or the way Paula Vogel got jerked around, or going farther back, she's getting a lot of play now, the way Alice Childress got jerked around, who similarly refused to make compromises and similarly lost Broadway productions because of it. It's an old story. And those are, again, paradigmatic examples of New York trying to impose a certain rubric on what a play needs to be in order to to stage it. I was blown away that Slave Play actually got a Broadway production. But what the big story was leading up to it is all the skepticism about whether or not it was even possible for this play to make it on Broadway. And it was almost like there was a fear in the New York critical community. They're like, well, we love this play, but we don't think other people will understand it. Well, guess what? It did fine. And it's because people are more willing to explore differences in form than they're given credit for.
Yeah. Well, it'll be really interesting to see as things resume over the course of this next year, how that changes. We've talked before about the fact that live theater is likely to come back sooner in the regions than in New York City for a lot of, technical safety related reasons and economic reasons. And, this may be a shift point in the field where we see some things. A lot of the New York critics are now reviewing productions from companies around the country because everything's digital right now, as we've seen firsthand here. But it's, I don't want to bash New York critics too much because there are some really smart ones, and partly it's they are reviewing what's there in New York, and not everybody's traveling around the country and seeing what's happening, because theater is, in non-COVID times, only accessible in the community in which it's taking place. And so there's a lot of new awareness and exposure happening right now. And I think a lot of the stories of theater coming back will be happening around the country more than in just New York over this year. So there's an opportunity here for change. And I'm just looking at the clock. We've been going for a while. This has been one of the more fun conversations, and also, sort of one of the more all over the place. This wasn't so much, and here's a super disciplined dissection of a particular topic, so much as what do we want to talk about. And I have enjoyed it thoroughly. But I think we could say that is all for this episode of Theater Forward. Conversation about theater in Wisconsin, the Midwest, and America. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jenna Poff-Gray.
I'm Julie Swenson.
And I'm Mike Fisher. If you want more all over the place conversations, come to the place where form is being remade, which is this podcast as a microcosm of American theater. It's produced, as always, by Scott Hayden, the Renaissance man who is also everywhere that anyone can be. And you can follow us through his auspices and through his help at Facebook or Twitter. As always, it's Theater Forward with an ER on theater.
And if you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you might tune in. And we'd love to hear from you. Please write, send a review, email us.
We're so grateful to have you listening, and we will be back soon for another Theater Forward conversation.